We've been getting lots and lots of questions about creep feeding, what it is, if you should do it, and if it is worth the money. We are going to talk about it. By the time we're done with this video, you are going to know everything that you need to know about creep feeding and if you should or should not do it. I am Tim from Linessa Farm Specialty and Heirloom Livestock. We are your source for small ruminant health and wellness. What is creep feeding? Well, creep feeding is often thought about in a very, very wrong way. If you've talked to individuals about creep feeding, a lot of them will tell you, well, I don't creep feed. And when you ask them why, they say, well, I don't feed grain. And that is a prime example of someone that is confused about what creep feeding is. Creep feeding is basically just limiting the number of animals or the type and size of animals that can get to a specific location on your farm. You can creep feed even if you don't feed grain. You can creep feed if you only feed hay. You can even creep feed when you are out on pasture. Creep feeding, generally speaking, is allowing our littles, our lambs, our goat kids to get to a specific area that the adults cannot. Sometimes this creep area has grain. Sometimes this creep area does not. Even if you are out on pasture, you can segregate a nice area of your pasture, close it off, and have a creep gate that allows your littles to get in there and your bigs not to, and they might be able to get better access to better grazing or better quality forage. So when you think about creep feeding, you need to take that idea that it's only for grain and you need to get it out of your system. Should you grain feed is a completely different question. We got lots of questions about this. Should I put grain in my creep area or should I not? That is going to depend a lot on your breed and the way that that breed responds to grain feeding. And we've experienced this ourselves. I can tell you from personal experience when we were raising things like St. Croix, some other hare breeds, the conversion ratio was not very good when we had them on grain. That is to say, the amount of money that we got from feeding them grain versus just feeding them good quality hay generally was not there. Now, when we look at some of our terminal breeds, things like our boar goats, our Kiko goats, our blackface sheep that are designed for meat production, they do really, really well on grain feed through a creep. And you can figure this out. You can figure out if this works for you. And what you need to do is you need to look at your feed conversion ratio. Feed conversion ratio is when you take the weight of your lamb or your goat kid at birth, you take the weight at weaning, and then you divide it by the number of days. So if it was 60 days from birth to weaning, you would take the weight at birth and you would take the weight at weaning. You would subtract the birth weight from the weaning weight and you would divide it by the number of days that you had from birth to weaning. And that would give you an average amount of weight gained per day. You can bounce this at the amount of money that you spent on creep feed. You can divide it out and figure up how much you spent to feed this animal and how much more you're going to get out of them. You can do this by figuring out what is the amount of money that you're going to get at sale, and you can see if this works for you. Now, I've talked to some of our friends that raise pasture lambs and pasture goats, and some of them have said, yeah, the grain, it costs me more to feed them grain than I get out of it. And we've experienced this as well. Some breeds do really, really well on grain feeding, other breeds do not. Plus, you've got to look at the quality of the meat that you are getting added to these animals. Now, we have had our terminal lambs, our blackface lambs, that we've creep fed with grain, and then we compare that side by side with our perhaps St. Croix or Katahdins or even Dorpers in some cases that we've creep fed, and the numbers just don't work. The quality of the weight that's gained on some of these breeds is they're just gonna turn into little beach balls. When we think about the creep area, I want you to consider it as a area where the littles can get into. It's less stress. They have their own area. They have their own hay. They have their own water. They have their own mineral. You can choose to grain feed if you want, but the benefit is we don't have the fighting that goes along, the pushing and shoving that goes along with having these babies along with the adults, and we're looking to give them an environment where they can get what they need without the stress and grow as much as possible. I'm Tim from Linessa Farm Specialty and Heirloom Livestock. Thanks for joining us again today, and I look forward to seeing all of you again next time.